Thank you all for coming tonight. For those of you who are in confession, you're welcome to obviously stay for the talk afterwards in our Eucharistic Holy Hour. We're really pleased to welcome Deacon Matthew Newsome here to the parish. He is a Catholic campus minister at Western Carolina University, and he's been there since 2008. He holds a master's in theology from Holy Apostles College and Seminary, and he was ordained a permanent deacon for the Roman Catholic Diocese of Charlotte in 2018. He and his wife have 7 children, and they live in the mountains of western North Carolina on land they share with a small flock of sheep, a smattering of chickens, and 1 lovable donkey. He writes for the Catholic News Herald for the Diocese of Charlotte, and he also blogs at testeverythingblog.com. And he's going to be speaking tonight on beauty, the language of the soul. Followed by that, he will be leading a Eucharistic Holy Hour with benediction. So please welcome Deacon Matthew Newsome.
I have a green light. Ooh, there I am. Okay. My mother used to be a librarian at at the library at UNC Charlotte, right over here. So I remember being a little kid and riding with my dad right across the street to go pick up my mom from work. So it's very glad to be back home. Our help is in the name of the Lord, who made heaven and earth. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. So, as Tim said in that kind introduction, I am the Catholic campus minister at Western Carolina University up in the mountains. I've been there since about, hey, there's one of my students right there. I've been there since about 2008, and there's a tradition that we have up there. I didn't start. It was a tradition there before I was a student there myself in the 90s, but I've continued it because I think it's a good one for reasons that I'll mention. But it's at the beginning of each fall semester, so at the beginning of the academic year, I like to take the students hiking to a little place on the Blue Ridge Parkway called Water Rock Knob. And it's a wonderful little place to take a group hiking. It's got a little visitor center there. And even from the parking lot, before you even go anywhere, even from the parking lot, you get just these panoramic views of the Appalachian Mountains that just go on forever. They really do. And so we bring a picnic dinner. We go there in the evening. We have our dinner there at the little welcome area. And then the hike to the top is about a mile and a half. It's short enough that even inexperienced hikers, first-time hikers, can do it with no problem, but it's long enough that you really feel like you've accomplished something, by the time you get to the top. And it's not like a lot of mountain hikes where you have to get all the way up to the top to really enjoy the view. This one's got just spectacular views from the beginning to the end, all along the way. But of course, the best view is from the top, which is the highest point of elevation on the entire Blue Ridge Parkway. It's 5,820 feet, and from there it's just spectacular. So what I like to do is time it so that as we're walking back down from the top towards the visitors center, we're watching the sunset over those rolling mountains, and it's just spectacular. And for many students that come, especially if they don't come from rural areas, this might be the first time they've seen anything like that. And it just takes their breath away. I've done that hike more times than I can remember now, and it still takes my breath away. And that's why I like to start the year with this hike, because it's not because I like hiking, and it's not because I think it's a good, fun activity for the students to do. It's both of those things. But I like to show them right then at the beginning of the year the beauty of God's creation. I want to take them somewhere that's going to get them out of their own heads and just remind them of God's glory in a way that I could never do by preaching to them. And so this past August, not that long ago, we were on that hike, and I was walking down that mountain with one of my students named Matthew. He's a catechumen in RCIA, and I happen to share a name with him. So we were hiking down together, and we stopped at a certain point, not to catch our breath, but just to pause and in awe and take in the view that we were seeing a little bit longer. There were clouds over the horizon, just a little bit above, and that orange orb of the sun was low in the sky, and so it was casting shadows, these long shadows all across the valleys, and you could see a few birds just kind of soaring in these circles, and the sky was just striped, the yellow and the red and the orange and the pink, and we were just looking at that. And then Matthew said, I'm starting to appreciate how beauty is a sign of God's existence. And my heart just smiled, and I thought, yes, he's got it. That's what this is all about, So I said, tell me more. And he said, well, I know that everything in creation is good because God made it. And so the birds are good, and the animals are good, and the mountains are good, and the sun, they're all good just for existing as God made them. But the birds can't appreciate this, he said, kind of gesturing towards the sunset. He says, they don't know that this is beautiful. So the beauty isn't for them. It's for us. We can appreciate it. And that beauty doesn't seem to even have a purpose except to remind us of God. I want to tell you a little bit more about Matthew. When he started RCIA, not quite a year ago, I asked him during our first interview together something that I ask everybody who comes and say they want to join the church, and that is, what drew you to Catholicism? And usually it's a relative or a friend, that first introduced them to the church, or sometimes it's something that they've read or something they saw online that got their attention. But what Matthew told me is that he was thinking about his life and thinking about the fact that he was becoming an adult, and adults have responsibilities, and he felt an obligation to honor those responsibilities. And this whole idea of being an adult and fulfilling your obligations and doing the right thing got him thinking about the concept of morality. And that's what got him interested in Catholicism, because he realized that his desire to be a good person, what we call virtue, came from somewhere beyond him. It wasn't just something he was making up, right? And it was directed to something that was beyond him, that he had obligations not only to the world, but to God who made him. And the Catholic Church seemed to be the best place for him to figure out what those obligations were and how best to fulfill them. So, in other words, what drew him to the church, what drew him to God, was the idea of goodness. Goodness. Now, I'm also a convert to Catholicism. And that's one of the reasons why I really enjoy RCIA ministry. I mentioned that I grew up in Charlotte, and people hear that, and they say, oh, what parish did you go to? Did you go to St. Thomas? And I didn't go to any parish. I didn't grow up Catholic at all. I was a heathen out there in the wilderness. But what drew me into the church, I was first introduced to the church when I was 21 years old, when I was in college, and I started to date my wife, and she's Catholic, and so I would go to Mass with her, and I had an intellectual curiosity about her religion. I wanted to learn about her religion, and so I made it into like a research project. I read every book on Catholicism I could get my hands on, and once I started to do that, it didn't take me long to become intellectually convinced that the Catholic Church is the church that was established by Jesus Christ to teach and to govern and to sanctify the faithful for the salvation of souls, and that this is where we are able to find the fullness of God's truth in God's grace. And if I truly believed that, and at a certain point I realized that I did, then I couldn't willfully remain outside of the church and have any hope for salvation, not knowing what the church was. And so I had to become Catholic. I didn't feel like I had a choice in the matter. And so what drew me to God and what drew me to the Catholic Church, you could say, was the truth, the idea of the truth. Now, goodness and truth are two of what we call the Transcendentals. The Transcendentals. We call them these things, we call them Transcendentals because these are divine attributes that transcend the confines of our world, and they point to something beyond, namely to God, who is their origin. So, for example, when it comes to human behavior, we know that some actions are good and some actions are bad, but what makes good things good? And if evil acts fail to measure up against that standard of goodness, what are we measuring them against, right? There must be some objective goodness that our behavior can be measured against, some source for the very idea of goodness. So in other words, goodness seems to transcend this world and point to something else as its source. And that source of eternal and perfect goodness is God. Just as Jesus says in the Gospels, no one is good but God alone. And you can say the same thing about truth, too, right? We perceive reality with our mind, and we know that some things are true and other things are false. And we judge something to be false if it doesn't correspond to reality. But where does reality derive its being? That's just another way of saying, what makes reality real, right? Why are things this way and not another way? What's the source of reality? Well, the source of reality, and therefore the source of truth, is God, who is truth. And so what I'm saying is not that God is good and true, He is, but God is goodness and God is truth. And so everything else that's good or that's true is such because God made it such. And none of this that I'm saying right now is the stuff of special revelation. Even the pagan philosophers understood this. Now, the concepts of goodness and the concepts of truth are relatively easy for us to understand, even if we squabble over the details about what is true and what is good. But there's a third transcendental. There's this third transcendental attribute of God that's a little bit harder to grasp, perhaps, than truth or goodness, but which it's easier to intuit, and that's beauty. And this is what you've come to hear about, so I better start talking about beauty, right? This is what Matthew and I saw in that sunset hiking down from the mountain. Beauty. But what is it? What is this attribute exactly? And maybe it's because I was first drawn to the intellectual truth of the faith, or it could be because I was an English major in college, but I always like to begin with definitions. But the definition of beauty is frustratingly elusive. If you've ever tried to look it up and see, what is beauty exactly? Everyone has different ideas. St. Thomas Aquinas, I think, was better at defining things than just about anybody else, ever. And he defined beauty in the first part of the Summa as id quod videtur placet, which means that which being seen pleases. That which being seen pleases. But then he had to expand that definition in the second part of the Summa to include not only what can be seen, but also what can be heard. Because certainly music is beautiful, right? Speech can be beautiful. And I'd even go farther than that. I would suggest that certain tastes or smells or touches can be beautiful too, right? I mean, how else would you describe a gourmet dinner or the smell of a rose or the embrace of a loved one? These things are also beautiful. And modern philosophers, they take an even more expansive notion of beauty to include the possibility of a beautiful idea or a beautiful equation or a beautiful friendship. And I don't think they're wrong in that. Beauty comes to us in lots of different ways, and I think the many forms of beauty are part of what makes it so hard to define. I mean, what do a sunset and a supermodel and a sonnet all have in common that we can call them all beautiful? Right? I don't have an answer to that question, right? And I've spent a good deal of time reading up on this subject from people who are much more intelligent than I am, and they don't seem to have an answer to that question either. But just because our minds might not be able to define what Michelangelo's David or Leonardo's Last Supper or Mozart's Requiem have in common with a baby's laugh or the motion of a figure skater or the smile of the person that you're in love with, it doesn't mean that our souls aren't capable of recognizing that thing. And whatever that is, we give it the name beauty. We call it beauty. And maybe it's because it's so difficult to wrap our minds around that beauty reminds us, in a way, even more than truth and goodness, of the fact that we have souls. Because beauty seems to speak directly to our soul. It can bypass our heart and mind and just speak to us in the core of our existence. And it's everywhere. We can find beauty everywhere if we start looking for it. We find beauty especially in nature, right? Like my students and I watching the sunset over the mountains. You can find it in the patterns of the sand that's left by the receding tide, or the delicate form of a seashell, or the sound of songbirds in the morning. Crickets chirping, I even think that's a beautiful sound. Go outside at night and look up at the stars. They're beautiful. The creatures at the bottom of the ocean, they're weird looking, but they're beautiful. The leaves at this time of year, even in their process of dying, they're spectacularly beautiful. Nature is beautiful because nature is God's work of art. And everything that God makes is not only true because it exists, and it's not only good, as Genesis attests. Everything God makes, the author of Genesis says, God looks at it and said it was good. But it's also beautiful because at the core of his being, God is beautiful, and all art expresses something of the soul of the artist. And so therefore, we shouldn't be surprised to find out that out of everything in creation, what we're attracted to the most, what we find most irresistibly beautiful, is each other. It's because human beings are made in the very image and likeness of God, and so we reflect the beauty of the divine artist more than anything else God has made. That is, when our beauty isn't being obscured by the ugliness of sin. Adam rejected every other creature God made as a helpmate. But when he opened his eyes and he saw Eve, he said, "Here at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." He fell in love. Adam and Eve could be naked and unashamed because they saw in one another that reflection of God's beauty, undiminished by sin at that point. And here's something really cool. God finds us beautiful too. It's not just we who find ourselves beautiful. God finds us beautiful too. And if you don't believe me, just get your Bible, open it up right to the middle. Smack dab in the middle of the Bible is the Song of Songs, that great love poem that God wrote to us, his bride, his church. And in the Song of Songs, he talks to us and he says, "Ah, you are beautiful. Ah, you are beautiful, my beloved." He repeats it. "Your eyes are doves behind your veil. Your hair is like a flock of goats streaming down the mountains of Gilead." He means that as a compliment, by the way, although your wife might not see it as such if you try that line on her. I tried it. Didn't work. But understand that I'm not just talking about the physical beauty of the human person here. I'm talking about the intellectual beauty and the spiritual beauty as well, because we're capable of having beautiful minds and beautiful hearts and beautiful souls. And that inner beauty of the human person just pours itself out in so many ways, especially in our creative endeavors. You see it there in our practical handiwork, but it's most obvious in the arts. Because a piece of pottery or a piece of furniture or a building, they might be beautiful, but they don't have to be in order to be functional. But art, whether we're talking about a novel or a painting or a sonata, it has no purpose other than to be beautiful. That's why ugly art is such an oxymoron. Right? Ugly art isn't art at all. It's even if you hang it in a museum or erect it in the middle of town square, I don't know to call it. It's not art. Because when we create art, we're actually doing something that's divine. So you might even say ugly art is sinful. Here's what I mean by that. When we create art, we're doing something divine. You can build a house or you can build a table because you need those things, right? You need a shelter. You need a place to eat your meals. But you paint a picture or you compose a song just for the joy of it. It doesn't have a purpose. We don't need art, but we desire it because we sense, not with our mind, but with our soul, we sense that having beauty in the world is good. And that somehow or other, even if we can't define it, beauty speaks to us in a way about goodness and about truth that's so deep and so profound that it seems to defy definition. You might even say that beauty speaks to us with sighs and groans too deep for words. It's a reference to the Holy Spirit, by the way. Look up Romans 8:26. And that's how God creates. God doesn't create out of need. God doesn't need anything. There's nothing God has ever made where he said, I need one of those. God doesn't need anything outside of himself. So when God creates, he creates out of the sheer joy of it because he too thinks it's good for beauty to exist. And that tells us a very important truth about God and how God feels about us. I think this is why Jesus says that when we feel anxious, we should consider the birds of the sky and the lilies in the field. Because if God saw fit to clothe them with such beauty, how much more does he take care of us? Because after all, we're worth more than many sparrows. So, beauty might be hard to define, but we know it when we see it, right? We know it when we see it. Now, ironically, that's how Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart attempted to define obscenity in 1964 during a First Amendment case. I'll know it when I see it. But it makes sense to me that obscenity and beauty might have similar non-definitions because obscenity is just the opposite of beauty. Just like you can define evil as the perversion of a good, I think you can define obscenity as the perversion of the beautiful. Because nothing can be obscene unless it was supposed to be beautiful. You can't have an obscene compost heap because you can't have a beautiful compost heap. But writing, music, and people can be obscene because writing and music and people are supposed to be beautiful. Now, there is, of course, that old saying that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and there's truth to that, but that doesn't mean that beauty is entirely subjective. One person might find a certain style of art or music more appealing than another, or a man might prefer brunettes to redheads, or a woman might prefer men with beards over men who are clean-shaven. I mean, who could blame her? But that's a subjective element of beauty. But just because there's a subjective element there to what we find beautiful, our individual tastes, our individual preferences, they all seem to fit in within certain universal norms. So, for example, nobody finds roadkill or a polluted river beautiful. And if they said that they did, we'd think there's something wrong with that person. But like the meaning of beauty itself, these objective standards of beauty also seem impossible to define. And I think it's maybe because objective truth and objective goodness, the objectivity of those things, it's easier for us to discern that we might think beauty is somehow less important. I mean, truth, after all, is the recognition of reality, and reality is a brute fact. It simply is. It is what it is, and to deny reality is the very definition of insanity. And goodness, similarly, right? Goodness is what corresponds to the will of God, and God's will, like God's creation, is definite. And if you attempt to deny goodness, the existence of goodness, that's what makes you a sociopath. So truth and goodness are inescapable. They're undeniably real. But if you take them on their own, they can seem cold or even cruel. That's why people who focus on the truth of Catholic doctrine, or even the goodness of the moral law, to the exclusion of what's beautiful, come across to us like joyless Pharisees. And just like truth and goodness without beauty can be cold and hard, beauty without truth and goodness is just sentimentalism. Beauty alone might be more pleasant than truth or goodness alone, but it's much less powerful. You need all three. You need truth, goodness, and beauty, because God means for them to go together. In fact, you might even consider beauty to be the offspring of goodness and truth, because if you combine what's good and what's true, you get something beautiful. And that might be why we can recognize beauty, even if we can't define it, because we see in it something that's true and something that's good. Even if we can't explain it, there's something there that's familiar to our souls. And when we experience something beautiful, whether we're looking at a mountain sunset or a Renaissance painting or a baby's toothless grin, there's a sense that to deny that beauty, to deny the beauty of that experience, would be akin to denying something true and something good. You can also think of beauty as the ambassador of truth and goodness. Scientists will tell you that the beauty of an equation is a mark of its truth. Now, they can't prove that, because beauty is not something that's subject to the scientific method, but they'll say a beautiful equation, more often than not, is a true one. And all of the saints are beautiful because they're good, even the ones who defy our society's standards of beauty. Think about Mother Teresa, right? She was barely 5 feet tall. She's hunched over. She's as wrinkled as a raisin. She's not winning any pageants. But whenever I show my students a picture of Mother Teresa smiling, they all say, "How beautiful, how beautiful." Now, I said a moment ago that to deny truth makes you insane, and to deny beauty, or to deny goodness, rather, makes you a sociopath. What happens to us if we deny beauty? Well, denying beauty just makes you miserable. Right? You can live without beauty in a way that you can't live without truth or goodness, but it'll be a dull and bitter life, because beauty gives us joy. And you don't need joy. That's why joy is better than knowledge and even better than virtue. Right? You don't need joy, but that's what we'll experience in heaven. The joy of not being intelligent, or not the joy of being virtuous, but the joy of seeing God face to face, who's the source of all beauty. And St. John tells us that when we see him, we will be like him. And that means we'll be beautiful too, even more beautiful than we are now. There's nothing ugly in heaven. There's nothing ugly in heaven. If you want to know what heaven's like, if you want to know what the new heavens and the new earth will be like, take this world, remove everything that's ugly in it, and take everything that's beautiful and multiply it by infinity. That's heaven. Beauty has an effect on us that it does because, in a paradoxical way, beauty reminds us of something that we haven't seen yet. How can that be true? Beauty reminds us of something that we haven't seen yet. It reminds us of that beatific vision that St. Paul describes as, "Eye has not seen, and ear has not heard, nor has it entered into the heart of man what God has prepared for those who love him." We can't conceive of it, but we were made for it. And that's why this foreshadowing of it that we see in the beautiful things of this world seems like it's familiar to us. Even if we've never seen this particular thing before, we've never seen this particular sunset, we've never been to this particular mountaintop, we've never seen this particular painting, we've never seen this particular beautiful person, something about that experience feels like home to us. And it can even make us a little sad, because we know that that's not going to last. We know that while we're here in this earth, that's not going to last forever, and that moment will end. But it tells us a little something about where we're going, what we're made for. It reminds us of something that we haven't seen yet. So that's why I think for this new evangelization to work, we need to understand the role that beauty plays in leading people to God. Because our culture today is suffering deeply from a denial of objective truth and objective goodness. But you can't deny beauty. Beauty is irresistible. It just can't be denied in the same way that goodness and truth can be denied. Because beauty doesn't speak to the mind or even to the heart, both of which can be misled. Beauty speaks directly to the soul. And beauty reminds us that we're more than our minds, and we're more than our passions, as a way of cutting through all of that and just reaching directly into the inner recesses of our being where God longs to dwell and where we long for Him, even if we don't recognize that's what our longing is for. We may not know that we long for God, but we can hear a certain song or a certain story or see a certain picture, and it can make us feel that longing, just like a punch in the gut or the embrace of a lover. I think for a minute, you guys are faithful Catholics, I'm assuming, because you're here at a Catholic church on a Wednesday evening. Think about how the arguments you've probably gotten into over the years over some truth of the Catholic faith. You argue some point about the Eucharist or some point about Mary or some point about, pick your Catholic doctrine. And I don't know about you, but I'm finding more and more recently that I'm not dealing so much with people who believe different truths than we do as Catholics, as much as I'm having to deal with people who just don't believe at all. We're taught in our world today in both subtle and overt ways that truth itself is subjective, that we get to decide our own truth, even brute facts about our own biology. It's the reductio ad absurdum of Descartes' cogito ergo sum, right? I think, therefore I am. What Descartes did with that I think, therefore I am is he made the human mind the starting point of our experience of reality. Only the modern version of this is I think, therefore it is. I think, therefore it is. And of course, there's no shortage today of disagreement over moral issues in our society. Notice how it's not enough that abortion or same-sex marriage or contraception or pick any other moral evil is made legal. You have to accept them as good, or else you're accused of oppressing other people and imposing your opinion on them unjustly. Now, I know I said just a few minutes ago that truth and goodness are inescapable, and it might seem like I'm contradicting myself here by saying how much our world is denying the existence of truth and goodness. But that's not a contradiction, because you can deny them. You can deny truth and goodness, but they're still inescapable. You can deny them, but you can't deny the consequences of pretending that they're other than what they are. But you can deny them. And that's where we find so many people in our world today. And these are people that we long to reach. These are people that we love. But this is where they are. They're denying truth and they're denying goodness, even while deep down they hunger for these things, because they can't help but hunger for these things. And beauty can speak to that unspoken desire. This doesn't mean, of course, that people aren't still attracted to the truth of the faith, like I was, or to the goodness of religion, like my student Matthew was. Because, of course, those things will still continue to attract people. But I'm telling you, if you don't present the church's truth and the church's goodness in a way that's beautiful, there are a lot of people that just won't be interested. And even if they come for the truth and the goodness of Catholicism, they stay for the beauty, or they don't stay at all. If my intellectual attraction to the Catholic Church had just stayed in my head, and it hadn't worked its way down into my heart and into my soul, I would have left years ago. Because it's not enough to know God. You have to love God. And we only love what's beautiful. We only love what's beautiful. Any person you love, even the person that aggravates you the most, If you love that person, it's not because they aggravate you, it's because you see something beautiful in them. You recognize something beautiful in them. So that's why we need to rediscover what's beautiful in our liturgies, in our apologetics, in our evangelization, in our churches, and in our society. Because a person can deny every objective truth and every standard of goodness, but if you take them to a mountaintop and you show them a sunset, they can't deny that beauty. And if you take someone to the top of Mount Tabor and you show them the transfigured Christ, they can't deny that beauty and that glory. But you've got to know the way there. The summer after my freshman year in college, I took a road trip out west and I went to see the Grand Canyon. I don't know what my parents were thinking letting me go that far on my own, but I got in the car. I went out to see the Grand Canyon. It's a long haul from North Carolina, by the way. And I remember getting out there, and I'd seen pictures of it before. But I went out there and I stood on the precipice. And to this day, it's one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. Absolutely gorgeous. But I can't describe that to you. I can try. I can tell you how long it is. I can tell you how wide it is. I can describe the shape and the colors that I saw. And you can know these facts about the Grand Canyon. I can tell you that it's beautiful, and you can accept the fact that I think that it's beautiful. And you can even intellectually accept, well, it must be beautiful. But there's only one way that you can know its beauty. It's to get in your car and take a trip. You've got to see it for yourself. The only way to know beauty is to experience it for yourself. And that's why evangelization, effective evangelization, always should involve more showing than telling. I can tell you that God is three co-equal and co-eternal persons sharing in one divine being. And I can tell you that Jesus Christ has both a human nature and a divine nature united into one divine person. I can give you the definition of the hypostatic union. Those are facts that you can learn. You can learn them from any theology textbook. I can teach theology, I can teach morality, but I can't teach you that God is beautiful. You have to see it. You have to see it. And unless you know that God is beautiful, unless you've experienced that beauty of God, frankly, you're not going to care about theological formulas unless it's a matter of intellectual curiosity. I can't teach you that God is beautiful, but I can show you. I can show it to you in our worship. I can show it to you in the saints. I can show it to you in the best of our Catholic traditions, and on a very good day, if I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing as a disciple of Jesus Christ, I might even be able to show it to you in my own life. Think about how the gospel says Andrew introduced his brother Simon to the Lord. One sentence. It just says, John 1:42, he brought him to Jesus. He brought him to Jesus. He didn't try and convince him. There was no intellectual arguments. He brought him to Jesus. The Samaritan woman does the same thing. After she had her encounter with Jesus at the well, she invited her entire village to, quote, come and see this man. When John the Baptist evangelized, what did he say? Behold the Lamb of God. Our work today in the new evangelization is to do this same thing. Yes, you have to teach them the truth. Yes, you have to instruct them in goodness, but they're only going to listen to us if we first can lead them up the mountaintop, lead them into the sanctuary, show them that beauty, to say, look, see, behold, and invite them to look beyond that beauty to its source. This comes from somewhere. This is pointing to someone. The Catholic philosopher Peter Kreeft gives a definition of beauty that I like. and I'll wrap up with this. He defines beauty as the radiance of God. The radiance of God. He says beauty is to God what sunshine is to the sun. And I like that definition, because the radiance of God itself isn't the kind of thing you can define, but you can experience it. And I think by looking at some of your faces, a few of you have experienced that. Probably more than a few of you have experienced that. You can experience the radiance of God. I can't tell you what it is, but I can show it to you. You'll know it when you see it. You'll know it when you see it. And when you see it, if your eyes and your heart are open, then you'll see something of God. We've got a couple of minutes before we have adoration. I'm so happy that we're going to conclude our time together this evening with a time of Eucharistic adoration, because as I said, if we're going to take people up to the top of the Tabor, we have to know the way. If we want to show people the beauty of God, we have to experience that beauty ourselves. And there's no more direct or simple way of doing that than to come and place ourselves in the presence of God's presence in the tabernacle. So we are going to have a time of adoration tonight. It's going to be a time mostly of silence. Silence also is beautiful. Someone, I think it may have been Peter Kreeft, wrote in one of his books that silence is beautiful. Therefore, any sound that we make should be more beautiful than the silence that we're interrupting. But if anyone does have a question, I'm open to a question. Otherwise, I'll go get ready for adoration. Everyone's too afraid to ask a question after I said silence is beautiful. So, yes, sir.
I don't know that it's a question, but it's sort of going off of, you said, on a very good day,
Yeah.
I may be able to
Yeah.
show some of that beauty. And I think about Christopher Wetz, it sort of describes the marital union and how it's a sign pointing towards heaven. And to the degree that we get married right, we are being beautiful in a sense.
Absolutely.
And pointing towards heaven. So I would say that if we're striving to live as Christ lives, or as Christ taught us, to be more like Him, that we will be beautiful to a certain extent, and that beauty will continue to get better as we grow closer to Christ.
Absolutely.
Yeah, not just within ourselves, but within our marriages and within our families.
Absolutely.
Agree with that, or even maybe expound upon
No, I think that's absolutely right. I think that's beautiful. I would describe it that way. I think you're touching on what I said in my talk, that beauty in some ways can be seen as the offspring of truth and goodness. If I want to show you in my own life the beauty of God, and I said, okay, I need to make myself beautiful, I wouldn't even know how to begin. How do I make myself beautiful? I mean, any attempt that we have of doing that just ends up being narcissistic, right? And, oh, I've got these filters on Instagram, and I can make myself look beautiful that way. They end up being false. But if I set myself to, I want to be good, I want to live my life in accordance with what's good and in accordance with what's true, and I try and be faithful to my vocation, whatever my state in life might be, and I try and just do what God would have me do and love my neighbor and love the Lord, just in the process of what we call discipleship and trying to be a good, faithful Christian, we become beautiful. We don't have to try and be beautiful. We just become beautiful, because then that beauty that's innate to us, that beauty that God has placed in our being as creatures made in His image, it's going to radiate forth because we are being good and we are respecting what is true, and that is beautiful. So you can't have one without the other. It just comes as a natural consequence. And I think what attracts people to us, even though they may not articulate it this way, but I think this is how it works, what attracts people to that, when they see someone really living out faithfully the Christian life, even if you fail sometimes, right? People can see the difference between someone who's trying and failing sometimes and someone who's just not even trying or giving it lip service, you know. But they look at someone who's really trying to live their life and be a good person and live in accord with what's true and practice what they preach. And they may say, I want to be like Jim. I want to be like Sue or whoever, because they seem like a good husband or a good mother or a good whatever. But I think what really has drawn them to you initially is beauty, that sense of beauty. Look at their beautiful marriage. Look at the beautiful way that this person shows devotion. I see them in the church, every day at daily mass, and they don't seem like they're faking it. They seem so sincere. What is it that person has? Like, I want that in my life. We're drawn to it not at first because it's good or true, but because it is beautiful. So I think you're absolutely right. Just by trying to live our vocations, by trying to be good disciples of Christ, if we're making any effort in that whatsoever, and if we're open to God's grace, that's going to come through as beauty in our life, even if we don't perceive it. Other people will perceive that around us. Yeah, that's very perceptive. Thank you. Yeah. Mm. Yep. Yep. Yeah, me too. No, I think you're absolutely right. If and I don't even. It may not also always manifest itself as a repulsion to the things of God, but maybe even just an apathy to the things of God. Yeah. Now, the reverse is also kind of true, right? Because I know that at times in our spiritual life, we might be struggling with a particular vice, and there's always something in our sin that we find attractive. Right? There's always something, and there's something beautiful even in those sins, right? Don't misunderstand me, please, but there has to be, because if our sin was just 100% thoroughly ugly, it would repulse us. What we're attracted to is not the ugly aspects of the sin, but it's whatever kernel of beauty is still there, right? That's being perverted, that's being twisted, that's being maligned by the sin. But we're attracted to that beauty. I mean, think about Eve in the Garden of Eden. She looked at the fruit after the serpent tempted her. She looked at the fruit, and what does it say? She saw that it was good to eat. If the fruit was rotten and riddled with maggots, she wouldn't be tempted by it, right? There's always a certain beauty even in the sin that we're drawn to. So if we're at a place in our spiritual life where we say, I want this vice out of my life. I'm tired of dealing with this vice. I need growth in this area. And you can come to legitimately hate the sin that you're committing and still be drawn to it because hate's not strong enough. What you need to do is recognize the beauty in the opposite virtue. So if you're struggling with a sin of lust, it's not enough to learn to hate lust. You have to recognize that chastity is beautiful and fall in love with the virtue of chastity. Then all of a sudden, lust is a lot less attractive, right? If you're struggling with greed, selfishness, you've got to fall in love with charity and generosity. So it's recognizing the greater beauty and that beauty, because that beauty that you're drawn to in that sin, that beauty that's there in kernel form, you'll find that same beauty in its fullness in the opposite virtue. Satan just has a way of diverting our attention away from that and saying, no, look, over here, over here, over here, and God's pointing to the real thing. Yeah. Yes, sir. So heaven is pure beauty because heaven is that intimate union with God, right? The beatific vision. There's different ways that we use the word heaven. When I'm talking about heaven right here, I mean the beatific vision, that direct, unfiltered experience with God. Now, in a certain way, we can say that that's the same for all people because there's only one God. And so that God that we are receiving that vision of is the same God. So in that sense, you could say heaven is the same. But in a different sense, you can say that heaven will be different for everybody because, well, we're different, right? I mean, we're different. You guys are all sitting here in the same church. You're listening to the same speaker. You're all facing the same direction, but you're all having different experiences because you're different. And so I think the experience of beauty that we have in heaven is going to be subjective in that sense, in that we will still be individual subjects and we'll be receiving God according to our capacity, our openness to His grace, our openness to that beauty. None of us will be lacking anything. We'll all have a perfectly beautiful experience of God, but those experiences will be different because we're different, because God made us different. Right? Otherwise, if we were all the same, if we were all the same in heaven and we were all having the same experience of heaven, there'd only be two people in heaven, right? God and us. There wouldn't be any differentiation between everyone else in heaven. I guess that's really four people because Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and us. But you get my meaning. You get my meaning. Yeah. Does that sufficiently answer that? Okay, I don't know what else to say, so good. One more question, if anyone has one more question. No? Okay. Well, we'll get ready to ascend to Mount Tabor for a little time of adoration. I really, truly hope that you all can stay because the most beautiful thing that you can see tonight is certainly not me, but it's our Lord in the Blessed Sacrament, which it's my undeserved privilege to be able to show to you. So, thank you so much.